The second part of the introduction to The Matter with Things by Iain McGilchrist. Some potential causes of confusion. So much for what I am saying. Equally important is what I'm not saying. A. Surely we all use our brains as a whole, not just one hemisphere. Naturally, this is almost invariably the case. My point is a different one, that each hemisphere has inevitably a distinctive take on the structure of the world, which is why we have two hemispheres at all. And each take appears, when pondered in the abstract, strictly speaking, incompatible with the other. They're each internally consistent, but mutually incompossible. In the business of getting on with life, this is not a problem. We accept that the world is complex and multifaceted, and that truths are partial, and we wisely draw on what either hemisphere offers as the situation demands, without even being aware of it. In neurological terms, the two versions of the world are evenly and rapidly drawn on, probably mediated by a meta-control center in the midbrain, the head of the brainstem and one of the most ancient parts of the brain, a process which is necessarily below the level of conscious awareness. If it weren't, we would be incapable of acting. However, we live in a society where talking about life is as much our defining quality as living it. And when it comes to articulating a philosophy or a working model by which to understand our society and the wider world, that wisdom suddenly disappears in the mind of the public spokesman, politician, or scientist, in the need not to appear foolish. We become unnaturally self-scrutinizing, and self-consistency suddenly becomes of prime importance. Regrettably, we would rather speak falsely, if doing so means we do not seem to contradict ourselves. We realize that it is much simpler for our point of view to be dismissed as self-contradictory than untrue. Given this cast of mind, it is easy to see how one might easily argue one's way into believing something which one knows perfectly well at a deeper level to be untrue. We are virtually forced to it by our desire to appear consistent to some rather too simple position. Under these circumstances, two things follow. First, we are under almost irresistible pressure to adopt a view consistent with one hemisphere's take or the other. It is too risky to draw, as we should, on both. And second, one of these takes, namely that of the left hemisphere, is very much simpler. Indeed, it is simplistic, and therefore far easier to articulate. It sees matters as black and white, either or. The right hemisphere sees the nuances, as well as that we often must embrace two superficially incompatible truths in a both and. One, moreover, that includes embracing both its own take and that of the left hemisphere, altogether a far harder and more complex view to articulate. It is the purpose of education to enable us to do just this. So it is clear which will get adopted by those who want to appear smart. The preference for consistency over truth is itself characteristic of the left hemisphere, as we will see, and it is inevitable that it results in an espousal of its own take. B. Are you suggesting that the brain causes human experience? I do not suggest that the brain originates anything. I do not know that the brain causes consciousness. It might or it might not. For example, it might transduce or otherwise mediate consciousness. I have my own view on that, which I'll come to in a later chapter. But it is a matter of likelihoods. I know of no way of proving the point one way or the other, since the observable facts would look the same whether it gave rise to or simply mediated consciousness. Just as an alien could not tell merely by looking in the back of the TV set whether it gave rise to or transmitted the material it shows. In any case, nothing in the hemisphere hypothesis depends on the question being decided one way or the other. Nor do I suggest that the brain determines events in the lived world, whether at the level of an individual or of a society in general. I do think one way of looking at human experience is to look at how it is shaped by the choices our brain permits us. But there are many other ways. For example, if you ask me why I robbed an old lady, I could reply I needed the money, I had just watched a violent video, I inherited my dad's psychopathic tendencies, I was high on crystal meth, I heard a voice tell me to do it, I was brought up in a subculture where it was considered normal to steal, the government cut my welfare payments, my serotonin levels were depleted, and so on. What counts as a possible cause depends on the context of the question. I do not invoke the brain in order to trump other types or orders of explanation, be they psychological, sociological, environmental, genetic, economic, technological, or political, especially since they're inextricably intertwined one with another. Indeed, I do not attempt to explain experience at all in the causative sense, nor do I invoke the brain in order to tell us what experience really is, which it never could, but to illuminate the constraints on our understanding, which it can. What I mean by that is best explained by analogy. While accepting that by definition no analogy can be exact when it comes to the brain and mind, because there is nothing at all like them to compare with, let me at least make the attempt. Imagine you are studying the migratory patterns of a certain species of bird. Although we see them soaring and wheeling like free spirits, free as a bird, we say, they are subtly tethered to the earth. They have freedom to go where they want, it is true, but within certain constraints that are dictated by the realities of their embodied being. To understand a bird's migratory patterns would require knowing something about the landscapes over which it flies, the opportunities for food and shelter they afford, the weather patterns they give rise to, and so on. These facts would not cause the migration, still less are they themselves the migration, nor could they explain it away. They would simply indicate the constraints on the migration that helped account for the pattern it tended to take. Sometimes, for contingent or no discernible reasons, a bird or birds might vary the pattern considerably and end up in Iceland instead of Scotland. But generally there would be a familiar shape to it, understandable in terms of the whole context. The nature of the land, sea, weather, fauna and flora through and over which the migration route passes. Imperfect inevitably as the analogy is, I think it can hint at something about the relationship between our experience and the brain. Understanding the structure of the brain and how it functions can help us see the constraints on consciousness, much as, to use another metaphor, the banks of a river constrain its flow and are integral to its being a river at all, without themselves being sufficient to cause the river, or being themselves the river, or explaining it away. All experience in this life as we know it, and this applies whether we conceive the brain as the originator or as a transducer of consciousness, comes to us through the brain and is therefore inevitably constrained and shaped by it. This is most obvious to us through there being many elements of our environment, certain pitches of sound, certain wavelengths of light, for example, that, though detectable by the brains of other animals, are not detectable by ours. It also becomes obvious when, through some stroke, injury, or other brain insult, aspects of normal experience disappear from the subject world. C. Are you suggesting that cultural changes reflect changes in brain structure? No. Of course, the brain is evolving all the time, so strictly speaking, there will be fine structural changes over a few thousand years, but it is not these I mean. The time period invoked is far too short for anything like that. It's not the changes in the brain itself that matter, but the way in which we use it. An analogy might be with a radio set. To begin with, you try different channels, but after a while you begin to tune into only one. The other channels are still there, it's just that you are no longer listening to them. D. Surely the hemispheres are always operative together. I frequently emphasize that both hemispheres are involved in absolutely everything we do. It cannot, however, be an argument against hemisphere differences. Both the scrub nurse and the surgeon are important members of the surgical team and work together at the same time on the same task. An operation becomes hazardous in the absence of one and impossible in the absence of the other. They work well together not because they have the same role, but precisely because they have different ones. E. How can you talk of a hemisphere as a whole? It's all about local regions. I do not deny the obvious fact that regions are important. One can subdivide them into ever smaller regions of interest until one is looking at tiny clusters of neurons and ultimately at the activity of a single neuron. Both in this book and in The Master and His Emissary, there is detail about localization, often in the notes, for those who wish to know more. But at the same time, there are emergent phenomena from the whole interconnected system at the hemisphere level, and neuroscience increasingly recognizes that we should think in terms of complex, widespread networks. There are two such networks par excellence, maximally connected within themselves, that are each capable of supporting consciousness on their own, the two brain hemispheres. At the phenomenological level, they are the most important and complex collocations of neuronal matter underlying consciousness. The hemispheres are massively more interconnected within themselves than they are connected to one another. So, as in life, science needs both narrow focus and broad vision. Great work is done at the local level. This book is about what goes on at a higher level than that of intrahemispheric regions alone, though a very significant intrahemispheric distinction that will emerge regards the inhibitory effect of the frontal region of each hemisphere on its own posterior cortex. Nonetheless, this should not be thought of in purely antagonistic terms, but in dialectical terms, whereby something new is brought about through their joint action. F. The differences are not absolute. This is of course true, and I often find it necessary to point out that hemisphere differences are never absolute. In biology, scarcely anything is absolute. For example, left or right-handedness, an issue I do not deal with in this book, and which is only indirectly related to hemisphere differences, is a commonly observed, highly significant phenomenon, but it is rarely absolute. In a complex system like the brain, it is never that there are black and white, all or none differences. Indeed, requiring them is itself a typical left hemisphere demand. Many significant facts are found out only by tendencies in large data sets. Except in an imaginary world, almost all truths are of this kind. It is also to some extent a matter of judgment what is considered a significant difference. Without generalizations, we come to a standstill, but it is in the nature of generalizations to be imprecise and allow of exceptions. The average annual temperature in Indonesia is indisputably higher than that in Iceland, a fact that has many consequences for the vegetation, animal life, landscape, culture, and economy of these two regions, as well as much else that differentiates their feel and the ways of life in each country. If someone who knew them both well called them two different worlds, we'd know what was meant. But it is also true that the highest average annual temperature ever recorded in Iceland is higher than the lowest average annual temperature ever recorded in Indonesia. There is overlap. This comment on dualities is beautifully illustrated by the Taijitu. There is a little bit of yin in the yang and a little bit of yang in the yin, and the duality of yin and yang, while remaining distinct, together compose a single perfect circle. Furthermore, in the case of the brain, what may start out as small differences are inevitably magnified, since there is a winner-takes-all principle at play. If one hemisphere is marginally better adapted than the other at a certain way of dealing with the world, it quickly becomes the preferred hemisphere to be involved in such tasks under virtually all circumstances, not just marginally more often than its counterpart. And with use, it becomes better adapted still. Thus, the hemispheres compound through experience the differences that genetics and embryology have laid upon them. G. But aren't you dichotomizing? I have not invented that hateful thing, a dichotomy. Some people are just against what they call dichotomizing, feeling it is simplistic. But such a view is itself simplistic. There are, after all, different types of dichotomies. Some are inevitable, such as between plants and animals, even though there exist microscopic life forms that defy such categorization. Some are entirely spurious. Elsewhere, I've quoted whoever it was who said there are two types of people in this world, those who divide the world into two types of people and those who don't. Dichotomizing has its problems. An example of a very poor dichotomy would be good drivers and bad drivers. There is no fundamental difference between the two. We have invented a dichotomy out of a continuum. It doesn't make the distinction entirely meaningless, but it is not a good example of a valid dichotomy. Then there are other continua where a dichotomy is more legitimate, though open to rather too many qualifications. For example, we can speak of left-wing and right-wing philosophies of society. This distinction does point to two underlying phenomena that are different in character, not just more or less of something. There is a continuum here, too, but it is between two in themselves coherent entities that, at least in their characteristic forms, are readily enough distinguished. There is more content and more purpose to the distinction here, misleading as I agree it can be at times. Then there is a dichotomy based on the existence of two separate phenomena, say Hinduism and Christianity. I'm not saying that there might not be people who claim allegiance to both at once, nor that there may not be commonalities between the worldviews involved. Nor obviously am I suggesting any form of antagonism between their proponents. I'm just drawing attention, for the purposes of argument, to the fact that these are two coherent entities which undoubtedly have points of overlap, but are generally distinct phenomena, culturally, historically, and philosophically. This is an example of a dichotomy which it would be irrational to disregard or pretend didn't exist. It obviously does. In other words, there are some dichotomies that have no basis, some that have a partial basis, in fact, and some that it would be mistaken to pretend don't exist. The division of the cerebral hemispheres falls into this last category, a dichotomy made not by me, but by nature, which it would be profoundly irrational to ignore just because we don't like dichotomies. Evolution has taken care to preserve and even to intensify the division of the brain, this organ whose whole purpose is to connect. The hemispheres differ in their structure and function at every level. So let's not say we're dichotomizing when we take a look at why that should be. What every intelligent person should want to know is, why is this the case? I'm not saying I have all the answers, just some suggestions, appropriately backed by scientific evidence and open to modification in the course of time. All intellectual distinctions can be abused or misappropriated. Hemisphere difference is no exception. But the last thing we should do is ignore such distinctions because dichotomies don't happen to fit the view of the world we already happen to have. H. The hemispheres are more alike than they are unlike. This phrase has occasionally been used as if to counter the argument for hemisphere difference. But some level of likeness is not a proof that there are no substantive differences. Indeed, there's little point in comparing any two things unless they have some broad similarities. It is as though I were to say there are fascinating and important differences between a cat and a mouse, and you were to object that they have more in common than they have different. Whatever exactly this expression means, and it is not entirely clear, it is irrelevant because sometimes it's the differences that matter, as between Donald Trump and Albert Einstein, or an old banger and a new Ferrari. And so it is with the hemispheres. They have much in common, but when contrasting them, it's the differences that count. I. Actually, the hemispheres work in the same way. Importantly, we can describe, explain, and understand complex systems at different levels. Those who stick resolutely to one level will fail to comprehend points made at another level. This fallacy is easy to spot for those with clinical experience of the brain as part of a person, because they see it every day. But it appears harder to spot for those who are more comfortable with machinery than human beings. As a result, some neuroscientists have difficulty shifting focus from the machine level, a level irrelevant to the differences that are being posited. Actually, the hemispheres do not work in entirely the same way, even at a technical level, but that is beside the immediate point. Such objectors might, to use the same example, contradict the suggestion that the cat and the mouse see the world differently, along the lines that in order to see the world they both, as indeed do humans, use almost identical visual systems involving the retina, optic tracts and radiations, tectum, visual cortex, etc., which comprise distinct dorsal and ventral streams, and so on. Similar arguments can be made about every aspect of the organism as long as you examine them purely at the level of mechanism. This objection has its point, but the point is irrelevant, since cat and mouse see the world and perceive the world in other modalities differently and make sense of it in different ways, which are reflected in different types of behavioral responses that can be experimentally measured. Moreover, these differences are not just single independent facts that have to be strung together or extended from one area, say vision, to another, say hearing, because they're all part of one large underlying difference which makes sense of the whole, what it means and what it takes to lead two very different types of life, that of the predatory cat and that of the watchful mouse. The basic mechanisms at the technical level that help them see are irrelevant not just because they are largely held in common by cat and by mouse, but because they lie in the wrong plane of focus. It would be like trying to examine the difference between Fox News and Al Jazeera by focusing on the mechanics of studio lighting, cabling, cameras, TV signal transmission, cathode ray tubes, plasma/LED screens, etc., and solemnly concluding there was none. This is particularly likely to happen the more we rely on imaging data, in which we're essentially looking at the detail of the wiring. By contrast, lesion studies, split brain studies, and tachistoscopic or dichotic listening tasks, laboratory techniques that make it possible to separate input to each hemisphere, in which we are working at a more phenomenological level, are likely to be more revealing. It may be responded that the hemispheres are complex machines, not separate conscious beings. But that is also misguided. A machine and a person are both just models that illuminate and obscure different aspects of the brain. The brain isn't actually either simply a machine or simply a person. Each hemisphere can obviously sustain consciousness on its own, and appears to sustain not just different cognitive strategies, but different goals, values, opinions, and emotional timbre, all of which are, in reality, inseparably interconnected with one another and with cognition. The person model looks like a better fit than the machine model, especially since a hemisphere is at least a manifestly important part of a person and isn't like any machine we've even got near inventing. In 2003, 4 researchers who spent many years examining split-brain patients commented in a jointly authored paper in the classic textbook of neuropsychology, Clinical Neuropsychology, that, with experience, examiners spontaneously refer to the 2 hemispheres as if they were distinct people, e.g., the left hemisphere was upset at the right hemisphere responses today. While such references may be regarded as shorthand for patterns of behavior with specific lateralized stimuli and responses, they nonetheless express a strong phenomenological sense of 2 coexisting streams of consciousness. Both hemispheres can probably be simultaneously and independently conscious. Both can simultaneously possess conflicting wills, so that the split brain can exhibit 2 distinct and possibly incompatible loci of moral responsibility. Equally, research on split brain patients taught Roger Sperry, who won a Nobel Prize for this work, that the 2 disconnected hemispheres function independently and in effect have a separate mind of its own. Each of the separated hemispheres appears to have its own private sensations, perceptions, thoughts, feelings, and memories. Each hemisphere has its own inner visual world, each cut off from the conscious awareness of the other. He also thought the evidence favours the view that the minor, i.e. the right hemisphere, is very conscious indeed, and further that both the separated left and the right hemispheres may be conscious simultaneously in different and even conflicting mental experiences that run along in parallel. In those days, notice, it was even necessary to argue that the right hemisphere was conscious at all. And Bogan, one of Sperry's most distinguished colleagues, refers to 2 crucial facts: that it takes only one hemisphere to have a mind, and that hemispheres can sustain the activity of 2 separate spheres of consciousness following commisurotomy. Here is Sperry again. Each hemisphere, in commisurotomy patients, can be shown to experience its own private sensations, percepts, thoughts, and memories that are inaccessible to awareness in the other hemisphere. Introspective verbal accounts from the vocal left hemisphere report a striking lack of awareness in this hemisphere for mental functions that have just been performed immediately before in the right hemisphere. In this respect, each surgically disconnected hemisphere appears to have a mind of its own, but each cut off from and oblivious to conscious events in the partner hemisphere. 30 years after he first wrote about hemisphere differences in the Scientific American, Michael Gazzaniga, another giant in the field who also worked on split-brain patients, was invited to revisit the topic in the light of 3 decades of research. His summary? Despite myriad exceptions, the bulk of split-brain research has revealed an enormous degree of lateralization, that is, specialization, in each of the hemispheres. More recently, Onur Güntürkün, one of the leading researchers in the field of brain lateralization today, and a winner of Germany's most prestigious science award, the Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz Prize, for his work on lateralization, has publicly supported the idea that the hemispheres underwrite different aspects of personality, as well as, of course, attention and cognition. I believe that, at a deep level, McGilchrist is right. In the hemispheres, with their differing components and capabilities, lie different facets of the personality. And Claude Brown and Sabrina Suffren, a leading research team in lateralization, see, as do I, a differing disposition that enables the hemispheres to work together and apart. The two hemispheres compete and cooperate with one another to maintain an online balance of two fundamentally opposed dispositions. The tendency in recent years has been to downplay the distinction so clearly made here, possibly part of the general denial that has surrounded, until recently, the topic of hemisphere differences.